I called my parents, coughing on thick black smoke as my livelihood burned to the ground. My father answered over the sound of live jazz music and clinking champagne glasses, telling me he was not going to ruin my brother's $20,000 country club birthday dinner just because I could not handle my own mess. He hung up on me while the roof of my barn caved in. Days later, he and my mother parked their luxury SUV in my driveway, demanding 50% of my insurance money to bail out my brother. My husband Jamal calmly handed them a single manila envelope. When my father opened it, his hands began to shake violently. Before I reveal what was inside that envelope and how it brought their fake empire crashing down, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to watch the people who should love you choose their golden child over your survival. The heat was the first thing that hit me, an oppressive, suffocating wall of it that made the air feel thick and heavy in my lungs. I stood 50 feet away from the west barn of my equine rehabilitation ranch, watching helplessly as orange flames devoured the roof timbers. The loud crackling of burning wood echoed in my ears, drowning out the distant wail of approaching sirens. Ash fell around me like gray snow, sticking to my sweat-drenched clothes and my face. I had spent the last 20 minutes sprinting through the thick smoke with my husband Jamal, pulling terrified rescue horses out of their stalls and moving them to the far pasture. My lungs burned with every breath, and my hands were blistered from gripping lead ropes, but the animals were safe. Now there was nothing left to do but watch a massive part of my life turn to ash. I am Zuri. I am 35 years old, and I pour my heart into rehabilitating abused and neglected horses on a 50-acre property I inherited from my grandpa Ezekiel. This ranch is my sanctuary. It is the one place where I feel truly grounded, far away from the toxic social climbing and superficial expectations of my family. But standing there in the flashing red glow of the fire, something broke inside me. A sudden, childish wave of panic washed over my usually steady mind. It is a strange thing about trauma, no matter how old you are or how independent you have become. A crisis can instantly revert you back to a frightened kid who just wants her parents to tell her everything is going to be all right. My hands were shaking violently as I pulled my phone from my pocket. My thumb smeared soot across the screen as I found my father Silas in my contacts and hit dial. I needed my dad. I needed him to say he was on his way to say they would help me through this disaster. The phone rang 3 times. With each ring, the roof of the west barn sagged further inward, sending a shower of sparks into the dark sky. Finally, the line connected. Silas answered the phone, but he did not say hello. Instead, I heard the unmistakable ambient noise of a high-end celebration. A live jazz band was playing a smooth saxophone melody in the background, punctuated by the polite laughter of wealthy people and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. Zuri, I told you not to call tonight, my father hissed into the receiver, his voice hushed but dripping with irritation. We are right in the middle of the first course. Dad, please, I gasped, coughing as a fresh wave of thick black smoke rolled over me. There is a fire. The west barn is completely engulfed. I do not know what happened. The fire department is on the way, but the whole structure is gone. Please, I need you guys. There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line, the kind of sigh a parent gives when a toddler interrupts an important adult conversation. I could picture him perfectly standing in his tailored tuxedo, smoothing his tie, annoyed that reality was intruding on his perfect evening. Zuri, listen to yourself, my father said, his tone utterly devoid of warmth or concern. Terrence is turning 40 today. This dinner at the country club cost us 20 grand. Your mother has been planning this for months. I am not ruining your brother's night and dragging everyone out into the dirt because one of your rescue animals kicked over a lantern. You wanted to run a dirty animal business instead of getting a real job, so handle your own mess. Do not call back. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone, staring at the black screen. The roaring of the fire seemed to fade into a strange, ringing silence in my ears. He did not ask if I was hurt. He did not ask if Jamal was safe. He only cared that my disaster was an inconvenience to his golden child's expensive milestone birthday. Terrence, the failing investment banker, who masked his bankruptcy behind leased luxury cars and custom suits, was always the priority. The concept of black excellence in my family was twisted into a shallow display of wealth and country club memberships. My father and my mother, Corinne, demanded absolute perfection and social prestige. Because I chose to get my hands dirty healing broken animals instead of climbing the corporate ladder, I was considered the family embarrassment. I did not break down crying. I did not scream. The tears that pricked the corners of my eyes dried instantly in the intense heat radiating from the blazing barn. I just tightened my jaw and wiped the heavy layer of ash from my face. That single phone call burned away the last remaining shred of hope I had that my parents would ever love me the way they loved Terrence. Jamal ran up behind me, his chest heaving. He was covered in soot from head to toe, his usually immaculate appearance completely erased by the night's chaos. He wrapped a heavy fire blanket around my trembling shoulders and pulled me against his chest. He looked at the phone clutched tightly in my hand and then looked at my face. He knew exactly who I had called. "They did not come, did they?" he asked softly. I shook my head, leaning into his solid presence. "No," I said, my voice flat and hollow. "Just like my college graduation, Jamal. Terrence had a golf tournament, so they skipped my ceremony. Tonight he has a $20,000 dinner. My barn burning down is just an inconvenience." Jamal tightened his grip around me. His dark eyes locked onto the collapsing barn, reflecting the orange flames. Jamal is a forensic accountant. He makes his living dealing with cold, hard facts, tracing hidden assets, and exposing financial lies. He rarely raises his voice, but I could feel the quiet, simmering anger radiating from him. He knew exactly how my family operated. He knew how they treated me, and he despised them for it. "We are going to get through this, Zuri," he promised, kissing the top of my soot-stained forehead. "We built this once. We will build it again. We do not need them." The wail of the sirens finally reached deafening levels as 3 heavy fire trucks tore down our long dirt driveway. For the next 2 hours, the property was a chaotic blur of flashing red and blue lights, shouting voices, and high-pressure water hoses battling the inferno. Jamal and I stood on the sidelines answering questions and watching the physical manifestation of my hard work turn into a soggy, charred ruin. By the time the sun began to peek over the tree line, painting the sky in pale shades of purple and gray, the fire was completely extinguished. The west barn was a total loss. Only the blackened skeletal remains of the support beams stood upright. The air smelled of wet ash and chemicals. The fire chief, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a soot-stained helmet, walked over to where Jamal and I were sitting on the tailgate of our truck. His expression was grim. He held something out to us, a heavy-duty plastic evidence bag. Inside the clear bag was a melted cylindrical object that looked like thick metal and bright red plastic. "What is that?" Jamal asked, sitting up straighter. "I need to ask you folks some questions," the fire chief said, his voice grave. We finished our preliminary sweep of the point of origin. This was not an electrical fault. We found this in the center of what used to be the feed room. It is a specialized high-intensity industrial flare. My stomach dropped. The exhaustion that had been weighing down my limbs was instantly replaced by a sharp, cold spike of adrenaline. I stared at the melted red plastic in the bag. "Are you saying someone set the fire on purpose?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The chief nodded heavily. "Yes, ma'am. Someone threw this flare directly through the ground floor window. This is arson." The word hung in the damp morning air, heavy and dangerous. Arson. This was not an accident. This was not a misplaced lantern or a faulty wire. Someone had driven down my private road, walked up to my barn, and intentionally tried to destroy my livelihood. Someone tried to burn down the legacy Grandpa Ezekiel had entrusted to me. Jamal stood up, his analytical mind already turning like gears in a complex machine. He looked at the flare in the bag and then turned to look at the tire tracks pressed deeply into the mud near the access road. Tracks that did not belong to our truck or the fire engines. A deadly calm settled over my husband, a focused intensity that meant he was already preparing for a war. "We need to check the cloud servers," Jamal said quietly, turning to me. "The local hard drives in the barn office are destroyed, but the security cameras back up off-site. We are going to find out exactly who drove down our road last night." I nodded, my heart pounding against my ribs. As the morning light washed over the destroyed barn, I realized that the true nightmare of this fire was not the loss of the building. The true nightmare was just beginning. Because while my parents were drinking champagne and toasting to their golden child, the ashes of my sanctuary were hiding a secret that would soon bring their entire fake empire crashing to the ground. I stared at the heavy plastic evidence bag in the fire chief's hand. The melted red casing of the industrial flare looked alien against the blackened soot covering my palms. Arson. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. This was not a faulty wire in the old barn. This was not a tragic accident caused by a restless rescue horse. Someone had driven down my private dirt road in the dead of night and intentionally tried to destroy the sanctuary Grandpa Ezekiel had entrusted to me. Jamal stepped forward and gently took the bag from the chief, holding it up to the harsh glare of the emergency floodlights. "My husband is a forensic accountant. He spends his days unraveling complex corporate fraud and tracking hidden offshore accounts. His mind is a steel trap designed to find the truth buried in the margins." I watched his dark eyes narrow as he inspected the blistered label on the side of the canister. The serial number was partially melted away, but a clear municipal batch code remained stamped deeply into the thick plastic. It was a specialized flare, the kind typically reserved for road crews and city zoning departments. Jamal did not need to vocalize what we were both thinking. We thanked the fire chief, who promised to file the official report in the morning. As the red emergency lights faded down the driveway, the crushing reality of the night settled over the ranch. The west barn was a total loss. The roof had caved in completely, leaving only charred beams smoking in the damp night air. I turned my attention to the only thing that mattered right then: the horses. I spent the next 6 hours moving between the temporary paddocks, checking every frightened animal. These were horses that had already survived abuse and neglect before finding a home here. Now they were trembling nostrils, flared coats thick with the stench of smoke. I brushed the ash from their manes, speaking in low, soothing tones, while examining them for burns or smoke inhalation. The physical labor kept me grounded. It kept my mind from spiraling into the dark realization that my own flesh and blood had ignored my panicked phone call just hours earlier to sip champagne at a country club. While I was out in the mud and the cold, Jamal transformed our kitchen into a war room. He brewed a pot of black coffee, opened his laptop, and went to work. Jamal had been quietly monitoring my family's financial activities for the better part of a year. It started when my father, Silas, began making passive-aggressive comments about the value of my land. Then came the phone calls from my older brother, Terrence. The so-called golden child of the family would call me late at night, asking for quick bridge loans to cover what he called temporary market fluctuations in his investment firm. I had always refused. I knew Terrence drove a leased Porsche and wore bespoke suits he could not afford. I knew my parents constantly bailed him out to maintain their illusion of black excellence. But Jamal knew the exact numbers. As the sun came up, casting a harsh light over the ruined barn, I walked into the kitchen to find Jamal surrounded by printed public records, LLC filings, and property deeds. He looked up from his screen, his expression tight. "This batch number on the flare is restricted," he said, tapping a pen against his notebook. "It belongs to the city supply cache. The same supply cache your sister-in-law Emily oversees for the zoning commission." My stomach plummeted, but I forced myself to breathe. "Do not jump to conclusions," I told myself, but Jamal was already 2 steps ahead, connecting the physical evidence to the financial motive. He pulled up a spreadsheet filled with red numbers. "Your family has been drowning for months, Zuri," he explained, turning the laptop so I could see. "Terrence's investment firm is nothing but a hollow shell. He has been taking out massive high-interest predatory loans to keep up appearances and pay off his early investors. And Silas co-signed every single one of them." Your father put up his own home as collateral to protect Terrence's ego. I gripped the edge of the kitchen island, my knuckles turning white. My parents had spent my entire life holding Terrence up as the ultimate success story. They paid for his Ivy League tuition while I worked 3 jobs to put myself through a state agricultural program. They constantly reminded me that I owed the family a debt of gratitude just for existing, while they handed Terrence the world on a silver platter. And now they were secretly facing total financial ruin to protect his fraudulent lifestyle. Over the next 3 days, the adrenaline faded, leaving behind a cold, heavy exhaustion. We worked from dawn until dusk, clearing the hazardous debris and securing the surviving structures. Every muscle in my body ached. The smell of wet ash permeated my skin, my hair, my clothes. Not once during those 72 hours did my parents call to check on me. Not a single text message to ask if I was safe, if the horses had survived, or if I needed a place to sleep. They had completely abandoned me to deal with the ashes. But Jamal did not rest. While I shoveled debris, he stayed glued to his monitors, legally purchasing the secondary debt portfolios that held my father's reckless loans. If my family wanted to play dirty games with money, Jamal was going to ensure we held all the cards. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, I was standing near the blackened foundation of the west barn, wiping sweat from my forehead. The air was thick and humid, making the smell of the charred wood even more suffocating. I heard the screen door of our farmhouse open. I turned to see Jamal walking down the porch steps. He was dressed in dark jeans and a crisp, button-down shirt, a stark contrast to my mud-stained work clothes. His face was a mask of absolute chilling calm. In his right hand he held a thick manila envelope. The way he gripped it told me everything I needed to know. The trap was fully loaded. He walked over to me, stopping just at the edge of the ash line. "Zuri, you are not going to believe what Terrence just leveraged," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He opened the flap of the envelope, preparing to pull out the financial documents that would expose my family's entire fake existence. Before he could hand me the papers, a loud crunching sound echoed down the driveway. We both turned. Tearing up the gravel road, kicking up a cloud of dry dust, was a brand-new silver Mercedes SUV. It came to a halt right next to Jamal's truck, parking aggressively close to the burned wreckage. The doors opened, and out stepped Silas and Corinne. My mother was wearing a pristine white designer blouse and oversized sunglasses. My father was in his usual tailored slacks and a cashmere sweater. They stepped out of the luxury vehicle and immediately brought their hands up to cover their noses, their faces twisting in utter disgust at the smell of the destruction. They had not come with water. They had not come with food or an offer to help me rebuild. They had come dressed for a country club luncheon, carrying a leather-bound clipboard. Jamal pushed himself off the side of his truck with a slow, deliberate movement. He did not rush. He walked across the soot-stained gravel with the measured, confident stride of a man who held all the execution codes. The thick manila envelope in his hand caught the afternoon sun. My parents watched him approach with expressions of greedy anticipation. They genuinely believed I was about to hand them a blank check. Corinne adjusted her oversized sunglasses and offered a tight, patronizing smile. "It is good to see you finally listening to reason, Jamal," she said. "Your wife has always been stubbornly attached to this dirt, but Terrence actually has a future to build. An investment firm needs liquid capital to thrive." Jamal stopped exactly 2 feet in front of my father. He held the envelope out but did not release it immediately when Silas grabbed the other end. "That is exactly why you came here today, right?" Jamal asked, his voice dropping to a low, icy timbre. "You came for liquid capital." Silas yanked the envelope from Jamal's grip, letting out a sharp scoff. "I came for what is owed to this family. Terrence is on the verge of a massive expansion. He needs 50% of the insurance payout to secure a commercial lease downtown. We are expanding the empire." Jamal stepped back and crossed his arms over his chest. "Then by all means," Silas opened the envelope. "Expand the empire." Silas tore the top of the envelope open with rough, impatient fingers. He reached inside, expecting to find an insurance settlement agreement or a certified bank check. Instead, he pulled out a thick stack of legal documents securely bound with a brass clip. The first page was printed on heavy watermarked paper, bearing the official seal of a private equity holding company. My father flipped past the cover page. I watched his eyes scan the first paragraph. I watched his brow furrow in confusion. Then I watched the exact second his brain processed the alphanumeric codes and the staggering dollar amounts printed in bold black ink. The arrogant sneer wiped off his face so fast it was almost comical. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His breathing hitched. The edges of the paper began to vibrate. Within 10 seconds, my father's hands were shaking so violently that the heavy document slapped against his crisp cashmere sweater. Corinne noticed the sudden shift. "Silas, what is it?" she asked, her voice losing its sugary edge. "Is it a lowball offer? We can sue the insurance company if they are trying to cheat us out of our half." Silas could not answer. He just stood there, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as his eyes darted frantically across the pages of debt. Corinne leaned over his shoulder, pulling her sunglasses down to read the documents herself. She let out a sharp, gasping breath. Her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder and hit the dirt. "What is this?" she demanded, looking wildly between Jamal and me. "These are bank records. These are property liens. How did you get these?" Jamal did not raise his voice, but every syllable cut through the damp air like a freshly sharpened blade. "You see, Silas, your golden boy Terrence is not expanding an investment firm. Terrence is running a glorified Ponzi scheme that collapsed 6 months ago. He has been taking out massive high-interest loans from predatory private equity groups just to pay off his early investors and keep his leased Porsche in the driveway." Silas swallowed hard, gripping the papers so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Where did you get this?" he rasped. "I bought it," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the man who had treated me like garbage my entire life. "I bought it all. My LLC quietly purchased every single piece of toxic debt Terrence generated over the last year, and because his credit was already ruined, we noticed he needed a co-signer for the most recent loans." I watched Corinne stumble backward, bracing herself against the hood of their pristine Mercedes. "That is right, Mom." I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. "Dad co-signed every single predatory loan to keep Terrence out of bankruptcy. That $20,000 birthday dinner you threw at the country club last night, you paid for it with a high-interest credit line that my holding company now owns. You did not come here today because you want to expand an empire." I stepped right into my father's personal space, forcing him to look me in the eyes. I could smell the expensive cologne mixing with the cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "You came here to scavenge my insurance money because you are completely broke," I said, watching his eyes widen in terror. "You came here because your primary residence, the house I grew up in, is exactly 30 days away from foreclosure. You need my money to save your golden boy from federal prison and to keep a roof over your own heads." Silas shook his head frantically, stepping back. "No, this is a mistake. We have assets. We have the manufacturing plant." Jamal pulled a sleek tablet from his jacket pocket and tapped the screen. "You leveraged the plant 3 months ago to cover a margin call Terrence completely botched. You have exactly $42.15 of actual liquid capital in your primary checking account. Everything else is a house of cards built on borrowed money and desperate lies. You owe Zuri's holding company $2.4 million, and the first massive balloon payment is due next Friday." Corinne let out a strangled cry, burying her face in her hands. She knew exactly what this meant. The country club memberships, the luxury cars, the carefully curated image of upper-class perfection, it was all gone. They were entirely at the mercy of the daughter they had thrown away. "You cannot do this!" Silas yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "We are your blood. You are going to call in a debt on your own family. We paid for your upbringing. We gave you everything." "You gave me a state school scholarship and a lifetime of emotional abuse," I corrected him without a shred of sympathy. "You saved your money to fund Terrence's fake life. You sat at a country club drinking champagne while my ranch burned to the ground. You told me to handle my own mess. Well, Dad, I am handling it. I own your house. I own your cars. I own your entire existence." Silas stared at me, his chest heaving. The realization that he was completely trapped, cornered by his own financial incompetence, and my strategic patience finally broke his facade. But instead of apologizing, instead of begging for the mercy he had never shown me, his panic morphed into a wild, desperate rage. He threw the stack of debt portfolios onto the ash-covered ground. "You think you are so smart?" He spat, his face twisting into a furious snarl. "You think buying some paper makes you the winner here? You are nothing but a girl playing in the dirt. You forgot who you are dealing with." I crossed my arms, unimpressed by his temper tantrum. "I know exactly who I am dealing with. A bankrupt man wearing a nice sweater." Silas pointed a shaking finger right at my face. "Terrence is not just going to roll over and let you take everything. His wife Emily runs the city zoning board. She has the entire municipal government in her back pocket. You think you can blackmail us with these loans? By tomorrow morning, Emily is going to officially rezone this entire agricultural property as a commercial hazard zone." Corinne looked up, her eyes flashing with a sudden venomous hope. "That is right," she hissed, wiping her face. "Emily already told us the fire gives the city full legal authority to condemn the property." "You will not be able to keep a single rescue horse on this land," Silas shouted, stepping forward with renewed arrogant confidence. "The city will fine you into oblivion. You will be buried in so many environmental hazard citations, you will be begging us to buy this useless land from you for pennies. Emily is drafting the orders right now. You try to collect on those debts, Zuri, and we will have this entire ranch bulldozed by Friday. We will see who holds the power then." Silas grabbed Corinne by the arm, dragging her toward the passenger side of their pristine SUV. He ripped the door open and shoved her inside before marching around to the driver's seat. He turned back to me one last time, a wicked, desperate smile stretching across his face. "Expect the city inspectors at dawn, Zuri. Family helps family, and Emily is going to make sure you lose everything you have ever worked for." He slammed the car door, threw the Mercedes into reverse, and peeled out of the driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of dirt and ash. I stood completely still, watching the dust settle over the ruined foundation of my barn. I did not flinch. I did not panic. I turned to Jamal, who was already putting his tablet back into his pocket. His face was perfectly calm. "They really think city zoning applies to state conservation borders?" Jamal asked, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "They are desperate," I replied, walking over to the scattered financial documents and picking them up from the dirt. "Desperate people make incredibly stupid mistakes. Let Emily come tomorrow. Let her bring her fake citations. It is time to let them dig their own graves." Jamal stepped away from the truck, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. He moved with the terrifying calm of a man who held every winning card in the deck. Reaching inside his tailored jacket, he slid out a thick, crisp manila envelope. The stark white label on the front bore the seal of my holding company. He extended his arm, holding the envelope directly out to my father. "That is why you came, right?" Jamal asked. His voice was ice-cold, stripped of any familial warmth or respect. It was the exact tone he used when dismantling corporate fraudsters in a federal deposition. Silas let out a sharp, arrogant scoff. He snatched the envelope from Jamal's hand with greedy haste. A smug, triumphant smirk spread across his face. He actually believed I had caved. He thought I was handing him a signed agreement for the insurance money or a certified bank draft to fund Terrence's fake empire. Corinne stepped closer, adjusting her designer scarf, her eyes gleaming with the anticipation of newly acquired wealth. Silas ripped the top of the envelope open. He reached inside and pulled out the heavy stack of documents. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I watched the exact second his brain processed the legal headers, the alphanumeric account codes, and the staggering dollar amounts printed in bold, undeniable black ink. The arrogant smirk vanished, wiped away instantly. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His breathing hitched, catching in his throat like he was choking on the ash filling the air around us. Within seconds, my father's hands began to shake violently. The thick stack of legal papers slapped erratically against his pristine cashmere sweater. He could not control the tremors. Corinne noticed the sudden drastic shift in his demeanor. "Silas, what is it?" she asked, her voice losing its sugary, patronizing edge. Is it a lowball offer? We can sue the insurance company if they are trying to cheat us out of our half. Silas could not answer. He just stood there, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as his eyes darted frantically across the pages of debt. Corinne pulled down her oversized sunglasses, leaning over his shoulder to read the documents herself. A sharp, strangled gasp escaped her lips. Her perfectly manicured hands flew to her mouth, and her designer handbag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the dirt with a dull thud. It was not a check. It was a complete, meticulously documented portfolio of their financial ruin. "These are bank records?" Corinne stammered, raw panic bleeding into her voice. "These are notices of default. How did you get these?" Jamal did not raise his voice, but his words cut through the damp air with absolute precision. "My firm specializes in toxic asset acquisition, Silas. When we saw the massive, high-interest predatory loans your golden boy Terrence was taking out to keep his failing investment firm afloat, we paid attention. When we saw that his firm was essentially a hollow shell bordering on a Ponzi scheme, we dug deeper." Jamal crossed his arms, his gaze locking onto my father. "And when we saw that you, Silas, had personally co-signed every single one of those toxic loans using your primary residence and your retirement accounts as collateral, we took action. Zuri's limited liability company quietly purchased that debt from the private equity lenders. We bought it for pennies on the dollar because the banks had already classified it as high-risk junk." My father stood paralyzed. He was reading the notices of assignment, the undeniable legal proof that his financial survival was now entirely in my hands. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. I stepped right into my father's personal space, refusing to let him look anywhere but at me. "You did not come here today for an insurance payout to expand Terrence's business," I said, my voice steady, ringing with the authority I had built for myself over years of hard work. "There is no expansion. You came here because Terrence is completely bankrupt. You came here because you co-signed his fraudulent loans, and now the bank is calling in the debt. You came here because your prestigious country club house is exactly 30 days away from foreclosure." Corinne shook her head frantically, stepping backward until she bumped against the sleek door of their luxury SUV. "No, this is a mistake. We are your family, Zuri. We paid for your upbringing. You cannot hold this over us. We can share the insurance money. We can fix this together." "You paid for Terrence," I shot back, dismantling her gaslighting instantly. "You paid for his Ivy League tuition while I worked 3 jobs to put myself through a state agricultural program. You demanded I be fiercely independent, so I became fiercely independent. I built this ranch from nothing. I bought your debt with my own money. You owe my company $2.4 million, and the first massive balloon payment is due next Friday." The reality of their situation crashed down on them. The country club memberships, the leased luxury cars, the carefully curated image of upper-class perfection they valued more than their own daughter. It was all gone. They were entirely at the mercy of the scapegoat they had come to exploit. But instead of apologizing, instead of showing a shred of remorse or begging for the mercy they had never shown me, my father's panic violently morphed into rage. He threw the stack of debt portfolios onto the ash-covered ground, his face twisting into an ugly, furious snarl. "You think you have won!" Silas shouted, stepping toward me with his fists clenched. "You think buying some paper makes you the winner here? You are nothing but a girl playing in the dirt. You forgot who you are dealing with." I crossed my arms, completely unfazed by his temper tantrum. "I know exactly who I am dealing with. A bankrupt man wearing a nice sweater." He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, his voice echoing across the ruined property. "Terrence is not just going to roll over and let you take everything. His wife Emily runs the city zoning board. She has the entire municipal government in her back pocket. You think you can blackmail us with these loans? By tomorrow morning, Emily is going to officially rezone this entire agricultural property as a commercial hazard zone." Corinne's face lit up with a sudden, venomous hope. She pointed at the charred remains of my barn. "That is right. The fire gives the city full legal authority to condemn this property for urban blight. Emily already told us she could do it. She has the power to shut you down permanently. You will not be able to keep a single rescue horse on this land. Silas spat his arrogance, returning in a desperate, ugly wave. The city will fine you into oblivion. You will be buried in so many environmental hazard citations that you will be begging us to take this useless dirt off your hands. Emily is drafting the orders right now. You try to collect on those debts, Zuri, and we will have the bulldozers here on Friday to flatten what is left of this place. He grabbed Corinne by the arm, shoving her toward the passenger side of their pristine vehicle. He ripped open the driver's side door, turning back to me with a wicked, triumphant glare. Expect the city inspectors at dawn, Silas threatened. Family helps family, and Emily is going to make sure you lose everything you have ever worked for. He slammed the car door, threw the SUV into reverse, and peeled out of my driveway, kicking up a massive cloud of dirt and ash. I stood perfectly still, watching the dust settle over the ruined foundation of my barn. I did not flinch. I did not panic. I turned to Jamal, who was watching the departing vehicle with a slight knowing smirk. We knew their threats were coming. We knew they would weaponize Emily's political position to try and crush me. Let them send the inspectors. Let them bring their fake citations. It was time to let them dig their own graves. The morning sun offered no warmth as it broke over the tree line, casting long, harsh shadows across the blackened footprint of my west barn. The air was perfectly still, trapping the bitter scent of wet ash and burned timber close to the ground. I had been awake since 4 in the morning, mucking out the temporary stalls and ensuring the rescue horses had fresh water and hay. My hands were blistered, my back ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, and a fine layer of gray soot clung to my denim jacket. But my mind was sharp. Jamal and I knew Silas had not made an empty threat. When cornered, my family always defaulted to the dirtiest tactics available, and they always used someone else to do their heavy lifting. At exactly 8 o'clock, the crunch of gravel echoed up the long driveway. A pristine white Ford Explorer with the city municipal seal emblazoned on the side doors rolled to a halt near the edge of the debris field. The engine cut off, but the doors did not immediately open. I leaned the pitchfork against the fence and wiped my hands on a rag, watching the vehicle with cold anticipation. Through the slightly tinted passenger window, I could make out the silhouette of my older brother Terrence. He was wearing a dark suit, his face turned away from the ranch, staring rigidly at the dashboard. He was too much of a coward to even look at the destruction his financial mess had brought to my doorstep. He was going to sit in the passenger seat of a city car while his wife did his dirty work. The driver's side door swung open, and Emily stepped out. My sister-in-law was the deputy director of the city zoning board, a mid-level bureaucrat who wielded her municipal authority like a loaded weapon. She was dressed in a tailored beige pantsuit and pristine beige flats, looking utterly absurd against the backdrop of mud manure and charred wood. She adjusted her clipboard, gave her blonde bob a quick toss, and signaled to the back seat. Two men wearing neon yellow municipal safety vests and hard hats climbed out, looking profoundly uncomfortable as they surveyed the ruined barn. Emily did not walk toward me immediately. She directed her inspectors to fan out around the perimeter of the ashes, pointing her manicured finger at the blackened beams and the waterlogged ground. The men dutifully began snapping photographs with digital cameras and scribbling on their clipboards, playing their parts in her orchestrated theater of intimidation. Once she was satisfied that her display of power had been established, Emily marched across the dirt toward the paddock where I stood. She slapped a look of deep, patronizing concern across her face, a perfectly practiced mask of bureaucratic sympathy. "Zuri, honey, this is just a tragedy," Emily called out as she approached, shaking her head. "Silas told us what happened last night. We came out as soon as the office opened. It breaks my heart to see the ranch looking like this. It really is a public safety nightmare." I did not move. I did not offer a greeting. I just stared at her, letting the silence stretch until her fake sugary smile began to twitch at the corners. Emily cleared her throat and looked down at her heavy clipboard. She flipped the metal clasp and pulled off a thick stack of bright yellow carbon copy papers. The patronizing warmth vanished from her tone, replaced by the crisp, sterile cadence of a city official executing a penalty. "As much as I hate to mix family with business, my hands are tied here," Emily said, holding the stack of papers out to me. "The fire department logged their report, and zoning is required to follow up on major structural incidents. I am slapping you with 6 environmental hazard citations. I looked at the yellow papers, but kept my hands at my sides. What exactly are you citing me for, Emily? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. She let out a dramatic sigh, adjusting her posture to look down her nose at me. Where do I begin? We have unauthorized accumulation of hazardous debris. We have potential chemical runoff into the local groundwater from the melted structural treatments. We have airborne particulate violations. And quite frankly, this entire property is now legally classified as urban blight. Because you run a commercial agricultural business within a residential proximity zone, these citations carry immediate daily fines. You are looking at $5,000 a day until the site is completely cleared, decontaminated, and surveyed by an independent environmental team. She thrust the papers closer to my chest. And since the structure is condemned, you are legally prohibited from housing livestock on this parcel. The animal control trucks are on standby to seize the horses if you do not comply. I glanced past her shoulder. Through the windshield of the city car, Terrence was still staring straight ahead, refusing to make eye contact. My parents had spent their entire lives treating Terrence like a king, funding his fake lifestyle, and telling me I was worthless because I preferred the reality of hard work over the illusion of prestige. Now the golden child was hiding behind his wife, letting her use fabricated municipal codes to steal the only thing I had ever owned. This cleanup is going to bankrupt you, Zuri. Emily continued, her voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial whisper. She leaned in closer, the scent of her expensive floral perfume clashing violently with the smell of the smoke. Even if your insurance pays out, it will be tied up in litigation for months. You do not have the liquid capital to survive these city fines. You are going to lose the horses. You are going to lose the land. It is a shame, really. But you know how strict the city is about blight. She paused, letting the weight of her fabricated threats settle in the air before delivering the extortion. But there is a way out, Emily said, her eyes gleaming with predatory greed. Terrence and I were talking. We can take this burden off your hands. If you sign the deed of the property over to Terrence today, I can use my discretionary authority as deputy director to waive these citations. We will take over the insurance claim. We will handle the debris removal, and we will give you a small relocation stipend to help you and Jamal find an apartment in the city. She smiled, a wide predatory grin that showed all her teeth. Family helps family, right? Silas and Corinne agree it is the most practical solution. Terrence needs the asset to stabilize his portfolio, and you need to escape municipal prosecution. Just sign the deed, Zuri. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant stomping of hooves in the paddock behind me. I looked at the neon yellow citations in her hand. I looked at the 2 city inspectors who were hovering awkwardly near the ruins, pretending not to listen to a city official extorting a private citizen. And then I looked back at Emily. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not fly into the defensive rage they were counting on to make me look irrational and unhinged. Instead, a deep, genuine laugh bubbled up from my chest. It started as a low chuckle and quickly grew into a full, resonant laugh that echoed across the quiet morning property. Emily stepped back, her smug smile dropping into a look of genuine confusion. Her face flushed a mottled, angry red. This is not a joke, Zuri. You are facing criminal negligence charges if you do not sign those papers. I stopped laughing and took a step forward. The amusement vanished from my face, replaced by absolute unyielding coldness. I reached out and slapped the clipboard out of her hand. The yellow citations scattered into the mud at her pristine beige feet. You really should have checked the county survey maps before you drove out here in a municipal car to commit extortion, Emily. I said, my voice carrying clearly across the yard to ensure her inspectors heard every single word. Emily blinked, glancing down at the papers in the mud and then back up at me. What are you talking about? I smiled, stepping even closer, forcing her to tilt her head back to look at me. You and Silas think Grandpa Ezekiel was a fool. You think he was just an old man playing in the dirt. But Ezekiel bought this land 50 years ago, long before your zoning board even existed. And when the city tried to annex this territory 10 years ago, he fought them in federal court and won. Emily's jaw tightened. She took another step back, her confidence visibly fracturing. "This ranch is not within city limits, Emily," I stated, driving the geographic reality into her skull like a nail. "The southern boundary of this property borders the state conservation line. Grandpa Ezekiel had this land federally classified as a protected agricultural and historical conservation hybrid. City zoning has absolutely zero authority here. Your ordinances do not apply. Your blight codes do not apply. You have no jurisdiction." I gestured to the two inspectors who were now staring at Emily with wide, panicked eyes. They knew the legal danger of operating outside municipal boundaries. "You brought city employees in a city vehicle to a state-protected conservation property to issue fraudulent municipal citations in an attempt to extort the deed from a private citizen." I continued, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "That is not just an overreach of power, Emily. That is a federal crime. If those men take one more photograph of my property, I am calling the state troopers to have all three of you arrested for criminal trespassing and official misconduct." Emily stood frozen. The blood rushed to her face, turning her skin a bright, blotchy crimson. Her entire extortion plot, the grand strategy Silas had threatened just 12 hours earlier, had evaporated in less than 3 minutes. She had walked onto my land, believing she held the power of the government, only to realize she was nothing but a trespasser standing in the mud. She looked at her inspectors, who were already backing away toward the city vehicle, completely abandoning her theater of intimidation. Humiliated and stripped of her leverage, Emily scrambled to pick up the muddy clipboard. She glared at me, her chest heaving with furious, impotent rage. "You think you are so clever," Emily sneered, her voice trembling as her professional facade completely shattered. "You think a historical classification is going to save you. Silas and Terrence are not done with you. We will find a way around the conservation line. We will petition a judge to override the boundary. We will see how clever you are when the city bulldozers show up on Friday to flatten this entire place." I stared at her, completely unbothered by her desperate screaming. "Get off my land, Emily, and take my brother with you." Emily spun around on her muddy beige flats and stormed back to the white Explorer. She yanked the driver's side door open, hurled her clipboard into the back seat, and threw herself behind the wheel. Terrence finally turned his head, looking out the window at me with an expression of pure pathetic terror, as Emily threw the car into reverse and sped backward down the driveway, desperate to escape the boundaries of her own humiliation. I watched the city car disappear past the front gates, the heavy silence returning to the ranch. The morning air felt instantly cleaner. I took a deep breath and turned back toward the surviving east barn. The heavy wooden doors slid open. Jamal walked out into the morning sunlight. He was holding his silver laptop in one hand, the screen glowing brightly. His dark eyes were locked onto mine, and the sharp, dangerous smile on his face sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight through my veins. He did not ask about Emily. He did not care about the empty threats of a defeated bureaucrat. Zuri Jamal said, his voice steady and vibrating with absolute certainty. "I salvaged the cloud security footage from the night of the fire." Jamal did not wait for my response. He turned and walked into the cool shade of the surviving east barn, gesturing for me to follow. He set the silver laptop down on an overturned wooden feed crate and angled the screen so we could both see. The glare of the morning sun faded behind us as the heavy barn doors provided a makeshift darkroom. My heart hammered against my ribs, a heavy, rhythmic thud that I could feel in my throat. I stood shoulder to shoulder with my husband, staring at the black loading screen. The local hard drives in the West Barn office melted when the roof collapsed. Jamal explained, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced speed. "But you insisted on that off-site cloud backup protocol last year. The fiber optic lines burned through at exactly 2:18 in the morning. That means we have a pristine digital record of everything that happened on this property up until the exact second the flames reached the server room. I pulled the raw data packets from the cloud and decrypted the video files while you were out here shoveling ash." He hit a final key and the screen blinked to life. A grid of 4 camera angles appeared, displaying the ranch in the stark, high-contrast black and white of infrared night vision. The timestamp in the upper right corner read 2:12 in the morning. The property was dead quiet. The horses were safely tucked into their stalls, and the long dirt driveway was completely empty. Watch camera number 3, Jamal said, pointing to the bottom left quadrant of the screen. I leaned in closer, my breath hitching. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. Then at exactly 2:14, a faint glow appeared at the very edge of the frame. The glow intensified, cutting through the absolute darkness of the rural night. A vehicle was creeping up the private access road. Whoever was driving had cut their headlights attempting to navigate the rutted dirt path, using only the pale illumination of the moon. The vehicle rolled to a slow, agonizing stop just outside the perimeter fence of the west barn. It was a large SUV. The driver threw the transmission into park, and a sudden flash of red brake lights briefly illuminated the rear of the car. Jamal tapped the spacebar, pausing the video. He maximized camera 3, bringing the rear of the SUV into full focus. He typed a few commands, running an enhancement filter over the grainy pixels. The shadows sharpened into distinct lines. The shape of the vehicle became undeniable. It was a pristine white Ford Explorer. Emblazoned on the side panel, perfectly catching the ambient light, was the circular municipal seal of the city zoning department. And mounted on the rear bumper, completely unobstructed, was a government-issued license plate. "It is Emily's city car," I whispered the words, tasting like poison on my tongue. She drove a municipal vehicle to commit arson. "Keep watching," Jamal instructed, his voice devoid of any emotion, save for a terrifying surgical focus. He pressed play. The driver's side door remained firmly shut. Emily was behind the wheel, acting as the getaway driver. Instead, the passenger side door slowly clicked open. A figure stepped out into the dirt. He was wearing dark clothes, but the infrared camera picked up the sharp, tailored lines of an expensive custom suit. The man moved with a frantic, jerky energy, looking over his shoulder toward the main farmhouse before turning his attention to the barn. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, cylindrical object. He twisted the top of the object, and suddenly, the black and white infrared footage was violently interrupted. A blinding, brilliant flare of chemical light erupted from the cylinder. The camera software struggled to adjust to the sudden, intense illumination, switching from infrared to standard color mode. In that split second of harsh, blinding light, the arsonist's face was perfectly illuminated. The perfectly groomed hairline, the sharp jawline, the expensive gold watch glinting on his wrist as he raised his arm. It was Terrence, my own brother, the golden boy, the man my parents had idolized and protected my entire life. I watched in absolute frozen horror as Terrence stepped up to the ground floor window of the feed room. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second before winding his arm back and hurling the burning industrial flare directly through the glass. The heavy canister shattered the pane and vanished into the dry hay and timber of the barn's interior. Terrence did not wait to see the fire catch. He spun around, sprinted back to the white Explorer, and threw himself into the passenger seat. The heavy doors slammed shut, and the city vehicle tore backward down the driveway, disappearing into the night, just as a massive orange fireball blew out the side of the barn. The video feed abruptly went to static as the flames incinerated the camera cables. Jamal closed the laptop with a soft, definitive click. The silence in the east barn was absolute. A profound, suffocating heartbreak crashed over me, threatening to buckle my knees. I reached out and gripped the edge of the wooden feed crate, my fingernails digging into the rough grain. My mind violently reeled, piecing together the horrifying reality of what I had just witnessed. This was not just financial abuse. This was not just my parents favoring their son or gaslighting me at family dinners. My own brother had driven to my home in the dead of night and intentionally set fire to my livelihood. He knew those rescue horses were in there. He knew I was sleeping just 50 yards away in the farmhouse. He had thrown an industrial chemical flare into a building packed with dry timber and hay because he needed a massive insurance payout to save himself from the consequences of his own fraudulent Ponzi scheme. He burned my sanctuary to trigger a crisis. Then he sent his bureaucrat wife to weaponize city codes, hoping to extort the property deed from me while I was distracted by the ashes. My family had literally tried to destroy me just to maintain their fake country club lifestyle. They were willing to watch my entire world burn to the ground to keep a leased Porsche in the driveway. Hot, stinging tears pricked the corners of my eyes. A lifetime of seeking my parents. Love, a lifetime of wondering why I was never good enough. A lifetime of trying to prove my worth through hard work and independence welled up in my chest. But as the tears formed, the memory of the intense heat from the blazing barn seemed to wash over my face, drying them instantly. The profound sadness inside me hit a solid, impenetrable wall. It did not shatter me. Instead, the sorrow crystallized. The childish hope that my family would one day love me evaporated into the damp morning air, leaving behind nothing but an absolute surgical ruthlessness. I let go of the feed crate and stood up straight. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling a strange, dangerous calm settle into my bones. The girl who just wanted her father to answer the phone and tell her everything would be all right was dead. She had burned to ash in the west barn. Jamal watched me closely, his dark eyes tracking the shift in my posture. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket. "I will call the police right now," Jamal said, his thumb hovering over the keypad. "We have the physical flair. We have the batch number tracing it to Emily's department. And we have crystal clear federal time-stamped video of Terrence committing felony arson and destruction of property. He will be in handcuffs before noon. They will lock him away for a decade." I looked at the silver laptop and then looked at my husband. The easiest thing in the world would be to make that phone call. The police would arrest Terrence, and my parents would simply spin a new narrative. "No," I said, my voice entirely devoid of warmth. I reached out and gently pushed Jamal's hand down, lowering the phone. Jamal raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Zuri, this is a slam-dunk federal case. We have him dead to rights." "I know we do," I replied, shaking my head slowly. "But going to the cops right now just sends Terrence to jail. It is too simple, Jamal. It is too clean. If we arrest him today, Silas and Corinne will just play the victims. They will cry to their country club friends about their troubled son. They will remortgage whatever hidden assets they have left to hire high-powered defense attorneys. Emily will claim Terrence stole the city vehicle without her knowledge, and she will keep her corrupt municipal job. The systemic rot of my parents' enablement will survive. They will find a way to slither out of the ruins and blame me for calling the police on my own blood." Jamal slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket. A slow, dark smile spread across his face as he realized exactly what I was saying. He crossed his arms, leaning back against the wooden stall door. "So what is the play?" he asked, his voice vibrating with absolute lethal support. I picked up my own phone from the makeshift table. I wiped a smudge of soot from the screen with my thumb, staring at Silas's contact name. "We are not going to call the authorities and let the justice system do a fraction of the work," I said, my tone dropping into a deadly whisper. "We are going to build an inescapable trap. We are going to let them believe their extortion plot is working. We are going to strip them of their money, their reputation, their fake legacy, and their freedom all at once. By the time the police arrive, there will be absolutely nothing left of this family to save." I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear, waiting for my father to answer the bait. I lowered the phone, pulling the device away from my ear before the line could even connect. My thumb hit the red end button, and the screen went completely dark. Not yet. The impulse to call Silas and unleash decades of pent-up rage was a powerful burning force in my chest, but I forced it down. Anger is loud and sloppy. Vengeance requires a quiet, meticulous patience. If I called my father right at that moment, my fury would bleed through the receiver and tip him off. He would know I was preparing to fight back. I needed the net to be completely woven and secured before I pulled the strings. Jamal watched me set the phone face down on the kitchen island. He understood exactly what I was doing. Without a single word, he walked over to the dining table, cleared away the remaining debris from our breakfast, and opened his silver laptop. The trap needed an impenetrable steel foundation. We spent the next 48 hours working in total synchronization, fueled by black coffee and a cold, calculated drive to end my family's reign of toxicity forever. The narrative inside our farmhouse shifted from defense to absolute offense. The pace of our lives accelerated into a blur of digital forensics and strategic maneuvering. Jamal was a maestro, orchestrating a symphony of financial ruin. His fingers flew across his keyboard as he bypassed the surface-level banking records we had already acquired and dug directly into the municipal vendor logs. Emily was the deputy director of the city zoning board, but she also had secondary authorization over emergency discretionary funds. Jamal started matching the dates of Terrence's most desperate margin calls with Emily's departmental expenditures. It took him less than a day to find the bleeding artery. He discovered a recurring municipal vendor named Apex Environmental Solutions. It was a company registered to a vacant post office box in Delaware with no physical equipment and no actual employees. Jamal traced the routing numbers through a labyrinth of shell corporations. The money flowed from the city's zoning emergency fund into the Apex account, then bounced to a holding company in the Caymans before landing directly in the operational account of Terrence's investment firm. Emily was not just abusing her bureaucratic power to extort my land, she was actively stealing taxpayer money to keep Terrence's Ponzi scheme afloat. She had been authorizing massive payments to ghost contractors, fake environmental survey firms, and phantom debris removal crews for nearly 2 years. Those shell companies funneled the municipal cash straight into Terrence's pockets so he could pay off his angry early investors and keep buying designer suits. My parents thought they were protecting a fiercely successful businessman, but they were actually enabling a massive public corruption syndicate. Terrence and Emily were embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars, and Silas had co-signed the predatory loans to cover the gaps. They were all drowning in federal crimes. While Jamal mapped out the sprawling blueprint of their financial ruin, I went to work on the physical crimes. Emily thought she could use the city government as a weapon against me because she knew the local police precinct relied on the zoning board for precinct expansions and municipal budget approvals. She thought she was completely untouchable in our zip code, so I went outside our zip code. I went straight to the top of the food chain. I bypassed the local authorities entirely and contacted the State Department of Insurance Fraud. I bypassed the standard hotline and used my connections as a licensed agricultural business owner to get a direct line to a senior investigator named Agent Harris. I sent a secure encrypted file containing the infrared night vision footage of Terrence throwing the restricted municipal flare into my barn. Agent Harris called me back within 20 minutes. Her voice was sharp and entirely devoid of the bureaucratic red tape I expected. Arson for profit committed by a relative combined with a fraudulent insurance claim was their exact jurisdiction. She requested the raw data files immediately. But I did not stop there. Emily had threatened me with environmental hazard citations citing chemical runoff into the groundwater from the burned structure. It was a beautiful, poetic piece of irony that I was going to wrap around her throat. I picked up the phone and dialed the regional director of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency. I explained clearly and concisely that a municipal government official had intentionally deployed a restricted chemical incendiary device on private property bordering a federally protected state conservation line. I detailed how the resulting fire caused toxic ash and melted industrial plastics to blow directly into the protected wetlands. The EPA director was absolutely furious. The federal government does not take kindly to local bureaucrats poisoning protected land. Within hours, I had a coordinated task force forming a silent, invisible perimeter around my family. Agent Harris from the State Insurance Board and Director Vance from the EPA organized a joint strike team. But they did not want to just arrest Terrence for lighting a match in the middle of the night. They wanted the entire corruption ring. They wanted Emily for misusing government resources and grand embezzlement. They wanted Silas and Corinne for financial complicity and conspiracy to commit fraud. To get the warrants for a complete sweep, they needed my family all in one place actively attempting to execute the extortion. The agents needed Silas, Corinne, Terrence, and Emily to admit on the record that they had orchestrated the fire to force me into signing over the deed to the property in exchange for the insurance money. They needed the final piece of the puzzle to snap into place. The authorities sent a covert technical team to my ranch under the guise of an independent equine veterinary crew. They wired my farmhouse living room with microscopic high-definition cameras and military-grade audio recorders. They planted microphones in the porch beams and positioned a mobile command unit inside an unmarked utility van parked a mile down the highway. Every single angle of my property was covered. The digital snare was perfectly set. It was Thursday evening. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, deep shadows across the ranch. The air was cool and crisp, finally free from the lingering smell of the smoke. Tomorrow morning was Friday, the day Emily had promised to send the city bulldozers to flatten my entire existence. Jamal and I stood in the quiet living room of the farmhouse. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I looked around the space I had built with my own hands. I looked at the framed photos of the rescue horses I had rehabilitated and the hard-won ribbons hanging on the wall. My family had looked at all of this and seen nothing but dirt. They had looked at me and seen nothing but a disposable stepping stone for their own shallow ambition. Jamal gave me a slow, steady nod from across the room. His eyes were dark and fiercely protective. He knew what this required. He knew how much it was going to cost my soul to play this part, but he also knew it was the only way to surgically remove the cancer of my family from our lives forever. I picked up my phone. I closed my eyes and dug deep into the bottomless well of pain my parents had caused me my entire life. I let the memories of every missed graduation, every dismissed achievement, and every cruel comparison to Terrence wash over me. I let the exhaustion of the past week seep into my throat. I forced my posture to slump, dropping the fierce independence that had kept me alive for 35 years. I forced my breathing to become shallow, erratic, and completely broken. I was no longer the strong, capable woman who ran a 50-acre ranch. I resurrected the frightened, neglected little girl who just wanted her father to love her. I tapped Silas's name on the screen and lifted the phone to my ear. The line rang twice, echoing loudly in the silent room. "Hello, Silas," answered his voice dripping with arrogant triumph. He already sounded like a man who had won the war. "Dad," I said, letting a pathetic, trembling sob slip through my lips. I forced my voice to crack, making myself sound utterly defeated and hollowed out by fear. "You win. I cannot fight the city. I cannot lose the horses to animal control. Please just tell Emily to call off the bulldozers. I will sign the deed over to Terrence tomorrow morning." "Hello," Silas answered on the second ring. His voice did not carry the cautious tone of a father receiving a call from a daughter whose property had just burned down. It carried the crisp, arrogant snap of a man who believed he had just checkmated his opponent. "Dad," I said, letting a heavy, shuddering breath rattle through my teeth. I pinched the bridge of my nose and forced a choked, pathetic sob into the receiver. "Dad, you win." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head as his massive, fragile ego swelled to fill the space between us. He did not ask if I was hurt. He did not ask if the fire had reignited. He just waited for me to surrender. "Emily's citations are going to ruin me," I stammered, letting my words stumble over each other in a perfect, flawless imitation of panic. "The daily fines are compounding. I cannot afford the legal battle to fight the zoning board and the city inspectors. The animal control trucks are threatening to come and seize the rescues. I have nothing left to fight with. I am completely out of money." I listened to him breathe, picturing him standing in the foyer of his foreclosed mansion, grinning like a king who had finally crushed a tedious peasant rebellion. "Please," I whispered, injecting just the right amount of desperate exhaustion into my vocal cords. "Just tell Emily to call off the bulldozers. Tell her to drop the environmental hazard claims and the urban blight classification. If she calls off the inspectors, I will give Terrence what he wants. Tell Terrence and Emily to meet me at your lawyer's office on Friday. I will sign over 50% of the ranch's deed. Just let me keep my horses." Silas let out a deep, booming laugh that made my stomach turn. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. He took the bait, completely swallowing the hook, the line, and the sinker. "I told you, Zuri," he said, his voice dripping with condescension and vindication. "I told you this would happen. You thought you could run off and play in the dirt forever. You thought you could survive without this family's guidance and financial protection. You thought you were so much smarter than your brother just because you liked to get your hands dirty. He spoke to me as if I were a disobedient toddler who had finally been disciplined. He was completely oblivious to the fact that every word he spoke was being captured by the military-grade audio recorders the federal task force had hidden in my ceiling beams. With every arrogant syllable, Silas was legally validating the extortion plot. He was confirming his active participation in a conspiracy to defraud a private citizen using corrupt municipal power. "This is how the real world works," he lectured, his tone pompous and grand. "Terrence understands capital. Emily understands leverage and bureaucratic authority. You understand nothing but shoveling manure. You should be down on your knees thanking us. We are stepping in to manage this prime real estate asset before you squander it completely on a bunch of broken-down animals." I squeezed my eyes shut, maintaining the illusion of a broken woman. "Whatever you want, Dad. Just please make it stop." "The horses are irrelevant," Silas snapped, annoyed that I was still focused on the animals. "We will finalize the deed transfer on Friday at 9 in the morning. My legal team is at Sterling and Vance. It is the glass high-rise right in the center of the financial district. Do not be late." He paused, and I could hear the familiar cruel sneer creeping back into his voice. "And Zuri," he added slowly, letting the insult hang in the air. "Dress appropriately for once. These are highly prestigious corporate lawyers. I pay them a fortune to handle my affairs. I will not have you embarrassing this family by tracking barn mud and smelling like smoke in a high-end corporate firm. Try to look like you actually belong in our world." "I will be there," I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. "See that you are," Silas commanded, and the line went dead. I lowered the phone and placed it gently on the kitchen island. Instantly, the pathetic slumped posture vanished from my frame. The forced tremor in my hands ceased. The fake tears evaporated, leaving my eyes dry, hard, and completely focused. I stood up straight, rolling my shoulders back and feeling the familiar, unyielding strength return to my spine. Jamal was watching me from across the kitchen, his arms crossed over his chest as he leaned against the counter. He let out a low, appreciative whistle. "You should win an award for that performance," he said, a dark, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "He bought every single word." "He bought it because he wanted to believe it," I replied, my voice returning to its normal, steady cadence. "He has spent 35 years waiting for me to fail. In his mind, my surrender validates every terrible parenting decision he ever made. It proves that Terrence is the superior child. His ego is so massive it completely blinds him to the reality that a broke woman cannot suddenly summon the authority of city zoning inspectors without a highly illegal conspiracy." Jamal walked over to the dining table where our physical evidence was meticulously organized. He began packing a sleek black leather briefcase. He slid in the encrypted flash drives containing the federal time-stamped infrared footage of Terrence throwing the chemical flare into my barn. Next went the thick printed dossiers of the toxic debt portfolios my holding company had purchased. Finally, he added the banking logs proving Emily had embezzled hundreds of thousands of municipal taxpayer dollars through fake environmental contracts to fund Terrence's failing investment firm. The federal agents have the audio recording of the phone call Jamal confirmed securing the brass clasps on the briefcase. Agent Harris and Director Vance are positioning their teams downtown. They have federal warrants for arson, grand embezzlement, insurance fraud, and official misconduct. We spent Thursday evening in a state of quiet, intense preparation. There was no anxiety left in my body. The heartbreak of realizing my own brother had tried to burn my livelihood to the ground had completely burned away. What remained was a cold, calculated anticipation. I was not just going to a law firm to confront my family. I was walking into a room to execute a surgical strike on their entire fraudulent existence. Friday morning arrived crisp and sharp. The sun broke over the surviving structures of the ranch, casting a golden light over the pastures. I stood in the bedroom of our farmhouse, having just showered away the last lingering scent of ash and smoke. I did not reach for my usual worn denim jeans, my flannel shirts, or my scuffed leather work boots. Today was not a day for the pastures. Today was a day to conquer the boardroom. Jamal walked into this bedroom. He was dressed in a flawless charcoal gray bespoke suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep burgundy tie. He looked like the apex predator of the financial world, a man who dismantled corrupt empires before he even had his morning coffee. He stopped a few feet away from me, holding something draped over his arm. He looked at me, his dark eyes filled with absolute unwavering respect. He knew the emotional toll this journey had taken on me, and he knew today was the day I finally severed the chains my family had wrapped around my neck. He tossed the garment to me. I caught it in one hand. It was a sleek, tailored designer blazer, sharply cut and midnight black. It was powerful, elegant, and entirely uncompromising. I slipped it on, feeling the heavy, expensive fabric settle perfectly over my shoulders. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, seeing a woman who owned her land, owned her debt, and owned her future. Time to show them exactly what black excellence looks like when it isn't faked, I said, picking up my keys and preparing to walk straight into their slaughterhouse. The drive into the financial district was cloaked in a heavy, purposeful silence. Jamal navigated the dense morning traffic with the effortless precision of a man who held the absolute upper hand. We did not need to review the plan. The federal task force was already in position. The state insurance fraud investigators were actively monitoring our communications. Every piece of the digital snare had been woven together flawlessly over the past 48 hours. We were simply delivering the final bait to a family of predators who had no idea they were already surrounded. We pulled into the subterranean parking garage of the towering glass skyscraper that housed Sterling and Vance. As we stepped out of the vehicle, I caught the briefest glimpse of a dark, unmarked utility van parked near the concrete pillars. Two men in suits sat in the front seats, their eyes tracking us for a fraction of a second before returning to their surveillance monitors. Agent Harris and Director Vance were ready. We rode the polished chrome elevator up to the 42nd floor. The reception area of the law firm was an intimidating, sterile expanse of white marble-brushed steel and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a sweeping panoramic view of the city's skyline. It was an environment deliberately engineered to make working-class people feel small, uneducated, and entirely out of their depth. For 35 years, my father had used this exact kind of corporate theater to reinforce his dominance over me. He relied on the illusion of prestige to break my spirit. But as I walked down the long, echoing corridor beside Jamal, I felt completely immune to the intimidation. The tailored black designer blazer I wore felt like a suit of titanium armor. I was not a terrified farmer begging for scraps from her wealthy relatives. I was the architect of their impending destruction. The receptionist led us to a massive glass-walled conference room at the end of the hall. Through the transparent barriers, I could see my family perfectly. They were already celebrating. Silas sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, holding a delicate porcelain espresso cup, like a king clutching a golden chalice. He was leaning back in his plush leather executive chair, laughing expansively at a joke Terrence had just made. Corinne was seated directly beside him, picking delicately at a silver platter of imported pastries. She had placed her oversized designer handbag on the empty chair next to her, ensuring the famous logo was facing outward for maximum visibility. Terrence and Emily occupied the opposite side of the table. Terrence wore a navy pinstripe suit that looked expensive, but fit him poorly, bunching awkwardly around his shoulders. He looked utterly relaxed, entirely detached from the fact that just a few nights prior, he had hurled an industrial chemical flare into my barn and nearly burned my entire livelihood to the ground. Emily sat next to him with rigid, perfect posture. Her bureaucratic mask of polite municipal concern had completely vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated greed. They were a portrait of toxic entitlement. They believed they had successfully crushed me. They believed their brutal extortion plot had worked flawlessly. Jamal pushed open the heavy glass door. The laughter in the room stopped instantly. Silas lowered his espresso cup, a broad, patronizing smile spreading across his face. He looked me up and down, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the sharp, flawless cut of my designer blazer. He was clearly surprised that I had not shown up smelling like smoke and wearing muddy work boots. But he quickly masked his brief moment of shock with his usual overbearing arrogance. "Ah, Zuri," Silas boomed, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You actually made it on time. I was worried your rusty little truck might have broken down on the highway. Please come in, sit down. We have a lot of paperwork to get through today." Corinne dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin, looking at my outfit with a critical passive-aggressive squint. "Well, look at you," she said, her tone dripping with fake maternal pride. "You actually cleaned up. Did you rent that jacket, sweetheart? It is a bit structured for your body type, but it is certainly a step up from those awful flannel shirts you insist on wearing." I did not respond to the bait. I did not let a single emotion cross my face. Jamal and I walked to the opposite side of the mahogany table and took our seats directly facing Terrence and Emily. Jamal placed his sleek black leather briefcase on the table with a soft, authoritative thud. He folded his hands perfectly over the leather, his dark eyes locking onto Terrence with a cold, predatory focus. Terrence visibly shifted in his chair, suddenly looking entirely uncomfortable under my husband's silent scrutiny. An older man with slick silver hair and a meticulously tailored gray suit entered the room from a side door. He carried a thick, heavy stack of legal documents. He introduced himself as Arthur Sterling, the senior partner of the firm. He was entirely oblivious to the explosive criminal tension vibrating in the room. To him, this was just another routine property transfer for a wealthy client. "We are here to facilitate the deed transfer and liability reassignment for the agricultural parcel," Sterling said, his voice a smooth, practiced corporate drone. He organized the papers, separating them into distinct, heavily stapled packets. "I have drafted the contracts precisely to your father's specifications." Terrence immediately leaned forward, unable to contain his desperate greed. He reached out and pulled the thickest stack of legal papers toward himself. He flattened the pages with his hands, making a dramatic show of reviewing the terms, scanning the bold alphanumeric codes and the liability clauses. I knew for an absolute fact that he did not understand a single word of the legal jargon printed on those pages. He was drowning in toxic debt, completely bankrupt, and relying on stolen municipal funds to survive, but he was still trying to play the role of the financial genius. Terrence looked up from the documents and slid the heavily weighted contract across the smooth mahogany table. The papers came to a halt directly in front of me. He reached forward to adjust the cuffs of his navy suit, shooting his sleeves back to expose his wrist. He tapped his fingers against the table, a deliberate gesture meant to draw my attention to the bulky gold watch strapped to his arm. He wanted to project immense wealth and unbothered success. But I had spent the last 5 years building a real business. I knew what authentic quality looked like. I knew the weight of real gold. I knew the smooth, sweeping motion of a genuine automatic movement. The second hand on Terrence's watch ticked with the rigid mechanical stutter of a cheap quartz battery. The gold plating was slightly too brassy, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room with a garish, artificial glare. It was a counterfeit. It was the perfect, undeniable metaphor for his entire existence. He was a hollow imitation of a successful man, completely reliant on the stolen resources of others to maintain a desperate illusion. "Do not feel bad," Zuri Terrence said, leaning back in his chair and lacing his fingers behind his head. He looked at me with an expression of supreme condescending pity. "You tried your best with that little farm of yours, but business is a man's game. It requires capital strategy and a stomach for real risk. You were always going to fail eventually." He chuckled, glancing at Silas for approval. "If anything, you should be thanking us for taking this massive liability off your hands. We are bailing you out of a complete disaster." Emily chimed in, stirring her espresso. The tiny silver spoon clinked against the porcelain with a sharp, rhythmic cadence. She smiled at me, a cold, bureaucratic smirk that made my skin crawl. "Terrence is right, Zuri," Emily said, her voice dripping with artificial benevolence. "This is the smartest move you could possibly make. As soon as you sign that deed over to my husband, I will personally make sure the city waives every single one of those environmental fines. I will call the inspectors off today. Consider it my gift to you. Family helps family, right? Silas nodded in vigorous agreement, tapping his knuckles against the table. This is a learning opportunity for you, Zuri. You let your stubborn independence blind you to the reality of the world. But Terrence is going to develop that land properly. He has the vision to turn that burned-out dirt into a real generating asset. All you have to do is sign the paper, and you can walk away from this mess with a clean slate. We are saving your life today. I sat perfectly still, letting their arrogant, delusional voices wash over me. They had laid out their entire criminal conspiracy right in the open. They had explicitly tied the fraudulent transfer of the property deed to the manipulation of municipal government authority. And the federal agents listening through the hidden microphones had captured every single damning syllable. The steel jaws of the trap had officially snapped shut around their ankles. They just had not felt the pain yet. I looked down at the thick contract resting on the mahogany table in front of me. The pages were crisp, filled with the dense legal language my father thought would bind me to his will forever. I reached out and picked up the heavy gold-plated pen provided by the lawyer. The cool metal of the gold-plated fountain pen felt heavy in my hand. I rolled it slowly between my thumb and forefinger, feeling the engraved ridges along its barrel. Arthur Sterling, the senior partner, offered a polite, encouraging nod, completely unaware that he was facilitating the climax of a massive extortion ring. Across the table, Terrence let out a long, theatrical exhale, sinking deeper into his leather chair, as if a massive physical weight had just been lifted from his shoulders. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed that piece of paper was his salvation, a magic eraser for his towering debts and his felony arson. My parents looked on with smug satisfaction, their faces glowing with a sickening cocktail of relief and vindication. Corinne adjusted her designer scarf, her eyes gleaming as she watched my fingers grip the pen. She let out a theatrical sigh, loud enough to ensure it commanded the attention of the entire room. Finally, Zuri, you are doing something right for this family, Corinne said, her voice dripping with maternal condescension. She reached over and patted Silas on the arm, a gesture of shared victory. This is for the best. Running a farm is dirty, exhausting work. It was never suited for you. Maybe now you can get a quiet little apartment in the suburbs and find a regular job. Something stable. Something that does not require us to constantly worry about your financial ruin. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air. Financial ruin. She was projecting their exact crisis onto me, wrapping their parasitic greed in the guise of maternal concern. Silas nodded in agreement, checking his own watch with an air of profound impatience. He adjusted his silk tie, refusing to even look me in the eye now that he thought the battle was over. Just sign the bottom line, Zuri. Silas ordered, his tone devoid of any remaining pretense of warmth. We have a celebratory lunch scheduled at the country club at noon, and I do not want to be late. The city inspectors are standing by, and Terrence needs to transfer this asset into his portfolio before the banking cutoff. Let us stop wasting time. Terrence slid the heavily weighted contract a few inches closer to me across the smooth mahogany table. He reached forward to adjust the cuffs of his navy suit, shooting his sleeves back to expose his wrist. He tapped his fingers against the table, a deliberate gesture meant to draw my attention to the bulky gold watch strapped to his arm. He wanted to project immense wealth and unbothered success. But I had spent the last 5 years building a real business. I knew what authentic quality looked like. I knew the weight of real gold. I knew the smooth, sweeping motion of a genuine automatic movement. The second hand on Terrence's watch ticked with the rigid mechanical stutter of a cheap quartz battery. It was a counterfeit. It was the perfect, undeniable metaphor for his entire existence. He was a hollow imitation of a successful man, completely reliant on the stolen resources of others to maintain a desperate illusion. Do not feel bad, Zuri, Terrence said, leaning back in his chair and lacing his fingers behind his head. He looked at me with an expression of supreme, condescending pity. You tried your best with that little farm of yours. But business is a man's game. It requires capital strategy and a stomach for real risk. You were always going to fail eventually. He chuckled, glancing at Silas for approval. If anything, you should be thanking us for taking this massive liability off your hands. We are bailing you out of a complete disaster. Emily chimed in, stirring her espresso. The tiny silver spoon clinked against the porcelain with a sharp, rhythmic cadence. She smiled at me, a cold, bureaucratic smirk that made my skin crawl. She crossed her arms, leaning forward to ensure I understood the absolute authority she believed she held over my life. Terrence is right, Zuri, Emily said, her voice dripping with artificial benevolence. This is the smartest move you could possibly make. As soon as you sign that deed over to my husband, I will personally make sure the city waives every single one of those environmental fines. I will call the inspectors off today. Consider it my gift to you. Family helps family, right? I did not move the pen toward the paper. I looked at Silas, then at Corinne, then at Emily. Finally, my gaze settled on Terrence, the arsonist, the man who had looked at my sanctuary and seen only a matchbook. I thought about the terrified rescue horses that had nearly burned to death so Terrence could keep wearing cheap counterfeit watches. I gripped the barrel of the expensive gold pen with both hands. I did not break eye contact with my brother. I applied pressure. The metal casing of the pen was thick, designed to feel substantial and authoritative, but under the sudden brutal force of my hands, it began to groan. Terrence's smug expression faltered. His brow furrowed in confusion. Zuri, what are you doing? He asked, his voice suddenly losing its confident swagger. I twisted and snapped. The heavy gold pen fractured cleanly in half with a sharp, violent crack that echoed off the glass walls of the conference room. A collective gasp went up from my family. Arthur Sterling jumped in his seat, his professional demeanor shattering instantly as he stared at the ruined office supply. I tossed the two broken, leaking pieces of the pen directly onto the center of the fraudulent contract. A thick pool of dark black ink immediately began to spill from the shattered ink cartridge. I watched with immense, profound satisfaction as the dark liquid bled across the crisp white paper, soaking right through the signature line and completely obliterating Terrence's printed name. The ink spread like a dark stain, ruining the pristine document they had spent thousands of dollars to draft. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice dangerously calm and utterly devoid of the pathetic trembling weakness I had faked on the phone the night before. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, mirroring the exact posture Terrence had assumed just moments earlier. I crossed my arms and leveled a look of absolute unyielding defiance at the people who called themselves my family. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the soft, steady dripping of the broken ink cartridge bleeding into the mahogany table. Then the shock violently transitioned into pure, unadulterated rage. Silas slammed his closed fist onto the table with such force that Corinne's espresso cup rattled in its saucer and spilled over the rim. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar, his face turning a deep, mottled shade of purple. The illusion of the sophisticated, wealthy patriarch vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate, cornered tyrant who realized his perfect plan was unraveling. "You little fool!" Silas roared, the sound bouncing violently off the glass walls. He lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "Do you have any idea what you have just done? You think this is some kind of game? You think you can walk into my lawyer's office, break his property, and disrespect me in front of my family? The bulldozers are already on their way to your property. Emily gave the order an hour ago. By the time you drive back to that miserable patch of dirt, everything you own will be flattened into mud." Emily jumped to her feet, her beige heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "He is right, Zuri!" she screamed, her bureaucratic mask completely gone. "I warned you. I gave you a way out and you spat in our faces. The zoning board is seizing the land today. You have absolutely nothing left. You are bankrupt, you are homeless, and you are entirely at our mercy." I did not flinch at their screaming. I did not raise my voice to match their hysterical panic. I slowly raised my left arm and calmly checked my watch. The gold hands glinted under the fluorescent lights. 10 in the morning. Right on schedule. I looked back up at my father, letting a slow, lethal smile spread across my face. Jamal shifted his stance beside me, radiating the calm, quiet energy of a man watching a trap perfectly spring shut. Actually, Dad, I said, my voice cutting through their screaming with chilling precision, the bulldozers are not on their way to the ranch. Emily did not give any orders this morning because Emily's municipal credentials were electronically revoked at 7 o'clock today. Emily froze, the blood draining from her face so quickly she looked ill. What did you just say? She whispered, her voice trembling as the reality of my words hit her. And the only people on their way right now, I continued, holding Silas's furious purple gaze, are right outside. Before Silas could open his mouth to scream again, the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a forceful, synchronized motion. The sharp, heavy tread of heavy-duty boots hit the hardwood floor, echoing through the pristine corporate space. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open with a forceful, synchronized motion. The sharp, heavy tread of heavy-duty boots hit the hardwood floor, echoing through the pristine corporate space. 3 individuals stepped through the doorway with the kind of unapologetic authority that instantly sucked the air out of the room. They were not wearing the neon yellow vests of local municipal workers. They were dressed in sharp, meticulously tailored federal suits. The tactical belts at their waists and the gold and silver shields clipped to their breast pockets caught the harsh fluorescent light of the boardroom. They moved with absolute precision, fanning out to secure the perimeter of the conference table, effectively blocking the only exit. Dad, Terrence. Emily, I announced, standing up slowly. I buttoned the front of my tailored black blazer, my voice steady, resonant, and entirely stripped of the fake desperation I had fed them on the phone. I would like you to meet Agent Harris, the lead investigator for the State Department of Insurance Fraud. To her right is Director Vance of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, and guarding the door is Chief Miller of your local police department. The shock hit them with the physical force of a tidal wave. The delicate porcelain espresso cups rattled violently against their saucers as Silas and Corinne flinched. Terrence turned completely sheet white. The arrogant, condescending smirk he had worn just minutes earlier vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, visceral terror. The blood drained from his face so fast his skin took on a sickly, translucent gray hue. He shrank back into his expensive leather chair, his shoulders hunching forward, suddenly looking incredibly small inside his ill-fitting navy suit. But Emily, blinded by years of unchecked bureaucratic power, refused to surrender her illusion of control. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor, and jumped to her feet. She squared her shoulders and thrust her chin into the air, attempting to assert the local dominance she wielded in her tiny municipal office. I am a city zoning commissioner, Emily shouted, pointing a manicured finger at Chief Miller. I have the mayor on speed dial, and I oversee the municipal budget for your entire precinct. You have absolutely no jurisdiction to interrupt a private legal meeting in a corporate law firm. I want your badge numbers, and I want you out of this room before I take your jobs. Chief Miller did not even blink. He crossed his arms over his chest, completely unbothered by her shrill threats. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer, my fingers wrapped around the cold, solid metal of the encrypted flash drive Jamal had prepared. I pulled it out and held it up, letting the silver casing catch the light. They do when the city zoning commissioner uses a government vehicle to commit arson for insurance fraud, I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical demands like a scalpel. I stepped forward and dropped the flash drive directly onto the center of the table, right next to the broken, leaking pieces of the gold pen. The drive hit the heavy wood with a sharp, definitive clack. I picked up the small, black presentation remote resting near the center console and pressed the central button. The boardroom TV flashed to life. The corporate logo disappeared instantly, replaced by the high-definition security footage. The video filled the massive screen, forcing everyone in the room to witness the undeniable truth. The footage showed the exact moment Emily's White City-issued SUV rolled to a stop outside my barn. It showed Terrence stepping out in his expensive suit. It captured the brilliant, blinding flare of chemical light, illuminating his panicked face and his cheap counterfeit watch as he hurled the incendiary device through the glass window. It showed him sprinting back to his wife's waiting getaway car before the building exploded into a massive orange fireball. The room erupted into sheer, unadulterated panic. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy family shattered into a million jagged pieces. Terrence immediately shoved his heavy chair backwards, scrambling to distance himself from the screen. He pointed a shaking finger directly at his wife. "She made me do it!" Terrence screamed, his voice pitching up into a desperate, cowardly wail. "It was her plan. She said the city could seize the land if the barn was gone. She told me how to bypass the security cameras. I just wanted to pay off my investors." Emily whipped her head around, staring at her husband with absolute venom. "You spineless, pathetic coward!" she shrieked, her bureaucratic mask completely dissolving into feral rage. "You were drowning in toxic debt. You begged me to find a loophole to get her property. You were the one who bought the flares. You threw it. You burned the building down." "It was your city car," Terrence yelled back, tears actually forming in his eyes as the reality of his impending prison sentence crashed down upon him. "You drove me there. You are an accessory." Corinne leaped to her feet, her carefully curated upper-class image dissolving into ruined mascara and shaking hands. "Do not speak to my son that way," Corinne wailed, stepping between them to shield Terrence. "Terrence is a good boy. He is a victim here." Zuri manipulated him. "Zuri set this up to ruin us." Chief Miller stepped forward, placing his hand firmly on his utility belt. "Everyone stay exactly where you are," he commanded, his voice booming with seasoned authority. "Not another word." Arthur Sterling, the senior partner who had just been demanding my signature on the fraudulent deed, moved with the rapid, frantic speed of a man trying to outrun a falling safe. He had been pressing himself against the glass wall, completely horrified by the criminal conspiracy unraveling in his pristine conference room. He swept his hands across the mahogany table, violently gathering his legal pads and the ink-stained contract. "Sterling, what are you doing?" Silas choked out, his voice barely a rasp. "Fix this. I pay you $1 million a year on retainer. Shut them down." Sterling shoved the papers into his leather briefcase and zipped it shut with a loud, aggressive rip. He looked at my father with an expression of pure, unvarnished disgust. "I am formally terminating our attorney-client relationship," Silas Sterling said, adjusting his suit jacket. "You could pay me $10 million. I cannot represent you in federal criminal matters. My firm handles corporate property transfers, not racketeering and arson. Do not ever contact this office again." Sterling did not wait for a response. He marched briskly toward the door side, stepping the federal agents, and vanished down the long white marble corridor, leaving my father entirely defenseless. Director Vance of the EPA stepped up to the table. He did not yell. He did not need to. His presence carried the devastating weight of the federal government. He unclasped a thick, sealed manila folder and dropped a massive dossier directly in front of Emily. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack that made her flinch. "Mrs. Adams," Vance said, his low baritone rumbling through the room. "Attempting to rezone federally protected conservation land using a city office for personal financial gain while actively covering up a felony. Arson is a federal offense. You have abused your municipal authority to orchestrate a criminal conspiracy. You are officially relieved of your duties effective immediately. Your office is currently being raided by federal investigators and your assets are frozen." Emily stared at the dossier, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. The arrogant, untouchable zoning commissioner was gone, replaced by a terrified woman realizing she was going to spend the next decade behind bars. Agent Harris signaled to Chief Miller. The police chief unclipped the steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic rattling sound cut through Corinne's sobbing. He walked directly up to Terrence, grabbed him by the shoulder of his expensive navy suit, and spun him around. "Terrence Wilson, you are under arrest for arson, insurance fraud, and destruction of property," Chief Miller recited, snapping the cold steel cuffs securely around my brother's wrists. "Mom, Dad, do something," Terrence begged, crying openly now as the police chief forced him toward the door. "Do not let them take me. Call the governor. Call somebody." But Silas could not call anyone. He could not throw his money or his influence at the problem because his empire had just been vaporized. He sat paralyzed in his plush leather chair, his hands resting limply on the mahogany table. The patriarch who had spent 35 years lecturing me about the harsh realities of the world was completely broken. He had watched his golden child led away in handcuffs, his family name permanently destroyed, and his fraudulent legacy exposed to the federal government. Silas slowly turned his head to look at me. His face was gray, his eyes hollow and bloodshot. The commanding, booming voice he used to terrorize me was completely gone. Zuri. Why, Silas asked, his voice trembling, all of his pompous arrogance entirely stripped away. Why go this far over an insurance payout for a dirty barn? You could have just taken the money. Why destroy your own family? I looked down at the broken, leaking gold pen resting on the ruined contract. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the theft of my grandfather's legacy, and the rescue horses that had nearly burned alive in the dark. I looked back up, staring him dead in the eye with a gaze as cold and unforgiving as absolute zero. Who said anything about an insurance payout? And the silence in the conference room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, hyperventilating breaths of my brother as Chief Miller tightened the steel handcuffs around his wrists. Silas remained frozen in his plush leather chair, his bloodshot eyes darting between me and the broken gold pen, leaking black ink across his fraudulent contract. He was a man who had spent his entire life quantifying the worth of every person in his orbit. He believed he knew the exact price tag on my existence. He truly believed I was fighting a desperate, pathetic battle over a few $100,000 in insurance money. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored black blazer. My fingers bypassed my phone and found the thick, folded parchment envelope resting against my ribs. I pulled it out slowly, letting the heavy, cream-colored paper catch the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom. It bore the raised, embossed seal of the State Department of Natural Resources. I placed it on the mahogany table right next to the shattered pen and the digital flash drive that had just sealed my brother's fate. Jamal stepped up beside me, his presence a solid, immovable pillar of support. He rested his hand on the back of my leather chair, looking down at Silas with an expression of profound surgical detachment. We had planned this exact moment for months. We had mapped out every possible reaction, every desperate lie my family would try to spin. But seeing the absolute unvarnished defeat on my father's face was sweeter than any visualization. You spent 35 years calling me a fool. Dad, I said, my voice ringing with a calm, lethal clarity that commanded the attention of every federal agent in the room. You told anyone who would listen that Grandpa Ezekiel was a senile old man who wasted his life playing in the dirt. You thought his land was just a barren, unprofitable burden. You thought he left it to me as an insult because you truly believed that neither of us understood how the real world worked. I slid the cream-colored envelope across the polished mahogany. It came to a stop mere inches from Silas's trembling fingers. Grandpa Ezekiel did not leave me a liability. I continued enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. He knew exactly what he was sitting on. He spent decades researching the local water tables, consulting with independent geologists in absolute secrecy, because he knew that the second you found out, you would find a way to manipulate the deed and sell it to the highest corporate bidder. 3 months ago, my land was officially surveyed by state hydrologists. It was selected as the primary critical site for the state's new multi-million-dollar clean water aquifer project. The very dirt you and Terrence just tried to burn to the ground sits directly above the largest untouched subterranean water reservoir in the entire county. Silas stared at the envelope. His hands twitched involuntarily, but he lacked the physical strength to reach out and open it. His mind was violently struggling to process the magnitude of his miscalculation. He had spent the last 48 hours treating me like a naive, desperate peasant while I was holding the keys to a municipal gold mine. Terrence, still restrained by Chief Miller near the frosted glass doors, let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. He turned his tear-streaked face toward the table, his eyes wide with a horrific mixture of realization and profound greed. Even in handcuffs, facing a decade in federal prison, his mind immediately went to the money. He had committed felony arson, and destroyed his entire life to secure a pathetic insurance payout, completely blind to the fact that he was standing on top of an absolute fortune. Emily remained completely paralyzed beside him. The EPA director stood over her, his presence a massive looming reminder of her obliterated career. She had risked her municipal authority, her freedom, and her reputation to steal a property she thought she could flip for a quick profit. She had thrown away her entire life for pocket change. I watched the greed and horror battle on my parents' faces. It was a fascinating, repulsive display of human psychology. Corinne's mouth was hanging open, her ruined mascara staining her cheeks as she looked from the federal agents back to me. The reality was finally piercing through her thick, upper-class delusion. "The ranch is not worth a pathetic insurance payout," I stated, my voice echoing off the glass walls. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the mahogany table, claiming the physical space and the narrative entirely. The state did not condemn my land. They did not classify it as urban blight. That was just Emily's corrupt, desperate fantasy. The state purchased the subterranean rights to my property while allowing me to maintain full agricultural ownership of the surface. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, forcing them to hang on to my every word. "It is worth $22 million. The number hit the room like a physical shockwave. Corinne let out a sharp, breathless gasp, clutching her chest as if she had just been struck by lightning. Silas slumped back into his executive chair, all the remaining color draining from his face. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just been thrown out of an airplane without a parachute. $22 million. It was a figure that completely dwarfed his failing corporate portfolio. It was a figure that could have saved his foreclosed mansion, paid off Terrence's fraudulent debts, and secured their fake country club lifestyle for another 50 years. It was ultimate, undeniable proof that the daughter he called a failure had surpassed him in every conceivable metric. And because I own this property, free and clear, I continued, my tone completely merciless. Because you and Terrence failed to bully me into signing over the deed, the state just wired the first $5 million of the payout directly into my corporate holding account this morning. Right around the time Emily was standing in the mud making empty threats about bulldozers, Jamal let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound of pure, unapologetic triumph. He looked at Silas, shaking his head with a look of supreme pity. "You really thought you were the smartest man in the room," Jamal said, his voice dropping into a low, mocking register. "You thought you could treat your daughter like garbage and steal her legacy. You are bankrupt, Silas. Your son is going to federal prison. Your daughter-in-law is facing a massive racketeering indictment. And Zuri is walking out of here a multimillionaire." The sheer crushing weight of the absolute defeat finally broke Corinne. She looked at Terrence, who was currently being read his Miranda rights by Chief Miller. She looked at Emily, who was being escorted out the door by the state fraud investigators. She looked at Silas, who was staring blankly at the mahogany table, completely unresponsive. And then she looked at me. In a split second, I watched my mother's brain reconfigure its survival strategy. The upper-class arrogance evaporated. The maternal condescension vanished. What replaced it was a raw, primal, parasitic desperation. She saw the $22 million. She saw the $5 million wire transfer. She saw a lifeline. Corinne suddenly shoved her chair back and stood up. She ignored the federal agents. She ignored the broken gold pen and the ruined contract. She leaned across the wide mahogany table, her hands reaching out toward me with an expression of frantic manufactured warmth. Tears streamed down her face, but her eyes were locked onto mine with a terrifying, predatory focus. "Zuri, baby," Corinne started crying, her voice cracking with a perfectly pitched, desperate sob. She stretched her hands out, grasping at the empty air between us. "Zuri, listen to me. We are family. You are my daughter. We have always been a family. You do not need to do this. You do not need to let them take your brother away." She gestured wildly toward Terrence, who was weeping openly by the door as the heavy steel cuffs dug into his wrists. "We can share this," Corinne pleaded, her voice rising in pitch, echoing shrilly through the boardroom. "We can fix everything. You have $5 million today. You can pay off Terrence's debts right now. You can talk to the police. You can tell them it was all a misunderstanding. You can pay off the bank so we can keep the house. We can all go back to normal. Zuri, please, you have to help us. We are your blood. I recoiled from her touch as if her skin were made of glowing embers. The sheer audacity of her grasping fingers. The exact same fingers that had pointed out every one of my perceived flaws for over 3 decades, now reaching out for a piece of my hard-earned sanctuary. I pulled my hand away from my mother's grasp, stepping backward to ensure a physical chasm remained between us. The heavy mahogany table felt like a protective barrier against her parasitic desperation. "There is no family, Corinne," I stated, my voice echoing with the absolute finality of a judge delivering a life sentence. "You burned that down with my barn." Corinne stared at her empty hands. The perfectly manufactured tears that had been streaming down her carefully powdered cheeks vanished instantly. When maternal manipulation failed, she had absolutely no other strategy to deploy. She shrank back into her chair, clutching her oversized designer handbag against her chest, like a shield looking to Silas for a rescue that was never going to materialize. I turned my attention away from her and looked toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room. Jamal had been standing there silently, a tall, imposing panther, waiting in the shadows. He had watched the entire performance with his arms crossed over his chest, his dark eyes tracking every frantic movement my family made with cold, calculating precision. "Jamal," I said smoothly, the command rolling off my tongue with effortless authority. "Execute the debt." Jamal did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal gray bespoke suit and pulled out his sleek black tablet. The glow of the screen illuminated his focused, unyielding expression. He tapped the glass screen twice. There was no dramatic flourish, no loud fanfare, just the quiet digital confirmation of absolute financial ruin. He looked up, his gaze locking onto my father with the intensity of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "Foreclosure proceedings have been officially initiated on Silas and Corinne Adams's primary residence." Jamal announced, his voice carrying the calm, steady cadence of a news anchor reporting the weather, as well as the liquidation of Terrence Adams's remaining frozen assets to cover the debts owed to Zuri's LLC. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Silas stared at Jamal, his jaw going entirely slack. The patriarch of the family, the man who prided himself on understanding leverage and capital, was completely unable to process the words he had just heard. "What holding company?" Silas croaked, his voice cracking violently. "My mortgage is held by Apex Financial. I have a 90-day grace period. You have absolutely no authority over my primary residence." Jamal slid the tablet onto the center of the mahogany table, directly over the dark ink stain left by the broken gold pen. He tapped the screen one final time, bringing up the official corporate registry documents in bright, undeniable high definition. "Apex Financial is a subsidiary shell corporation," Jamal explained, leaning forward, resting his palms flat on the table. "It is entirely owned and operated by Zuri. We bought the toxic paper on your heavily leveraged mansion 6 months ago, when you defaulted on your secondary loans to cover Terrence's failing investment firm. We bought Terrence's bad debt for pennies on the dollar when his partners abandoned him. You thought you were outsmarting a faceless hedge fund, Silas. You thought you could shuffle your assets around and hide behind corporate loopholes. You had absolutely no idea that your own daughter owned every single piece of debt attached to your name." I watched the color completely drain from my father's face. The mansion was his ultimate symbol of power. It was the physical manifestation of his superiority. He had used that massive house to make me feel small my entire life. And now I owned the very ground it was built on. "You are completely bankrupt, Dad," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal edge. "You do not own the luxury cars in your driveway. You do not own the country club memberships. You do not own the roof over your head. You spent your entire life hoarding resources and using them to punish me for being independent. So I used my independence to buy your entire world." The room erupted into sheer, unadulterated panic. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy family shattered into a million jagged pieces. Terrence let out a loud, pathetic wail. He shoved his heavy chair backward, scrambling to distance himself from the conference table. He pointed a shaking finger directly at his wife, his face contorted in sheer terror. "She made me do it!" Terrence screamed, his voice pitching up into a desperate, cowardly shriek. It was her plan. She said the city could seize the land if the barn was gone. She told me how to bypass the security cameras. I just wanted to pay off my investors. Emily whipped her head around, staring at her husband with absolute venom. "You spineless, pathetic coward!" she screamed back, her bureaucratic mask completely dissolving into feral rage. "You were drowning in toxic debt. You begged me to find a loophole to get her property. You were the one who bought the flares. You threw it. You burned the building down. It was your city car!" Terrence yelled, tears actually forming in his eyes as the reality of his impending prison sentence crashed down upon him. "You drove me there! You are an accessory!" Corinne leaped to her feet, screaming over the both of them. "Do not speak to my son that way!" Corinne wailed, stepping between them to shield Terrence. "Terrence is a good boy. He is a victim here." Zuri manipulated him. Chief Miller stepped forward, placing his hand firmly on his utility belt. "Everyone stay exactly where you are," he commanded, his voice booming with seasoned authority. "Not another word." Arthur Sterling, the senior partner who had just been demanding my signature on the fraudulent deed, moved with the rapid, frantic speed of a man trying to outrun a falling safe. He had been pressing himself against the glass wall, completely horrified by the criminal conspiracy unraveling in his pristine conference room. He swept his hands across the mahogany table, violently gathering his legal pads and the ink-stained contract. "Sterling." "What are you doing?" Silas choked out, his voice barely a rasp. "Fix this. I pay you a fortune on retainer. Shut them down." Sterling shoved the papers into his leather briefcase and zipped it shut with a loud, aggressive rip. He looked at my father with an expression of pure, unvarnished disgust. "I cannot represent you in federal criminal matters," Sterling stated, adjusting his suit jacket. "My firm handles corporate property transfers, not racketeering and arson. Do not ever contact this office again." Sterling did not wait for a response. He marched briskly toward the door, sidestepping the federal agents, and vanished down the long, white marble corridor, leaving my father entirely defenseless. Director Vance of the EPA stepped up to the table. He did not yell. He did not need to. His presence carried the devastating weight of the federal government. He unclasped a thick, sealed manila folder and dropped a massive dossier directly in front of Emily. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack that made her flinch. Mrs. Adams Vance said, his low baritone rumbling through the room. "Attempting to rezone federally protected conservation land using a city office for personal financial gain while covering up an arson is a federal offense. You are officially relieved of your duties effective immediately. Your office is currently being raided by federal investigators, and your assets are frozen." Emily stared at the dossier, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. The arrogant, untouchable zoning commissioner was gone, replaced by a terrified woman realizing she was going to spend the next decade behind bars. The police stepped forward. Chief Miller and Agent Harris pulled out heavy steel handcuffs for Terrence and Emily. The sharp metallic click of the restraints being tightened echoed through the room. Terrence was shaking so violently his knees buckled, forcing the police chief to support his dead weight. Emily was marched out right behind him, her head bowed in absolute crushing humiliation. Through the transparent walls of the conference room, I could see that the commotion had attracted an audience. Dozens of junior partners, paralegals, and legal secretaries had gathered in the white marble hallway. They stood in stunned silence, watching as the supposedly elite, untouchable Adams family was paraded through the corporate office in handcuffs like common street criminals. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the sound of Terrence's pathetic sobbing. The boardroom was suddenly very quiet. The federal agents were gone. The lawyers were gone. Only Jamal, Silas, Corinne, and I remained. Silas stood up. His movements were slow, rigid, and entirely lacking his usual dominating swagger. He looked around the massive glass room, his eyes scanning the empty chairs, the spilled espresso, the broken gold pen resting in a pool of dark ink. The empire he had built on a foundation of arrogance and cruelty had evaporated in less than 20 minutes. He turned to face me. The formidable patriarch, the man who had spent 35 years demanding my submission, began to physically tremble. His broad shoulders slumped forward. The crisp lines of his tailored suit seemed to collapse inward. Silas falls to his knees. The heavy thud of his bones hitting the polished hardwood floor sent a shockwave through the silent room. Silas Adams, the man who believed he was a king, was kneeling at the feet of the daughter he had thrown away. He looked up at me, his face contorted in a mask of sheer primal desperation. "Zuri, please!" Silas begged, his voice a ragged, broken whisper. Tears sprang to his eyes, spilling over his weathered cheeks. "Please stop the foreclosure. I will do whatever you want. I will publicly apologize. I will work for you. Just give us the house back. You can't leave us with nothing." He reached out, his trembling hands hovering just inches from my tailored black blazer, begging for the very things he had used to measure my worth my entire life. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the broken old man kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no remorse. The emotional chains he had wrapped around my neck for over 3 decades simply dissolved into dust. I remembered every time he had told me I was useless. I remembered the harsh, punishing lectures about self-reliance, the times he had intentionally let me struggle, just to prove that I could not survive without his money. I tilted my head, offering him a perfectly calm, entirely merciless smile. "I'm just teaching you independence, Dad," I said, my voice smooth and chillingly level. "You'll thank me later." Silas collapsed entirely, his forehead resting against the cold hardwood floor. A guttural, agonizing sob tore from his throat, a sound of absolute defeat that echoed off the pristine glass walls of the boardroom. Corinne dropped to her knees beside him, her trembling hands hovering over his shaking shoulders, too paralyzed by shock to even offer comfort. They were broken. The grand, impenetrable facade of the Addams family empire had been completely dismantled in less than an hour. Near the doorway, Chief Miller gave Terrence's arm a hard, authoritative yank. "Move it," the chief commanded. Terrence stumbled forward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the marble floor. He twisted his head back, his tear-streaked face contorted with panic as he looked at Emily. "You ruined my life!" Terrence screamed at his wife, his voice cracking horribly. "I had a plan. I was going to pay them back. You told me the city would seize the property. You told me we would be rich." Emily bared her teeth, her own hands cuffed securely behind her back as Agent Harris marched her forward. "You are an absolute idiot, Terrence," she shrieked, her tailored beige pantsuit looking absurdly out of place alongside the federal agents. "You could not manage a lemonade stand, let alone an investment firm. You burned down a building over a state-protected aquifer. You dragged me into your pathetic, incompetent mess. I am going to testify against you. I will tell them everything." "You are the one who bought the chemicals," Terrence wailed, his voice fading as the heavy frosted glass doors swung shut behind them. Their furious, vicious accusations bled into the hallway, echoing down the corridor, until the elevator doors finally clamped shut, sealing their fate. Inside the boardroom, the silence was deafening. I looked down at my parents. Corinne was kneeling in the puddle of spilled espresso, the dark liquid soaking into the fabric of her designer skirt. Her oversized luxury handbag lay discarded and forgotten near the leg of the mahogany table. Silas remained face down on the floor, his hands curled into tight, impotent fists. There were no high-powered attorneys left to save them. Arthur Sterling had abandoned them the moment the federal badges appeared. There were no country club friends to bail them out. There were no municipal loopholes to exploit. They were entirely stripped of the fake wealth and prestige they had valued over their own daughter. For 35 years, they had worshipped the illusion of capital while despising the reality of labor. They had treated me like a disposable asset, a human punching bag they could use to absorb their own massive insecurities. And now they were left with absolutely nothing. I did not feel the need to offer a parting lecture. I did not need to scream or demand an apology or force them to acknowledge the pain they had caused me. Their complete and total ruin was the only acknowledgement I would ever need. I turned to Jamal. He was already looking at me, his dark eyes radiating a quiet, unyielding pride. He offered his hand. I took it, feeling the solid, grounding warmth of his grip. "Let us go home," I said quietly. We turned our backs on Silas and Corinne Adams. We did not hesitate. We walked toward the heavy glass doors, our footsteps echoing with calm, deliberate precision across the hardwood floor. "Zuri, wait." Corinne choked out, her voice a desperate, raspy whisper behind me. "Please." I did not stop. I did not turn my head. I pushed through the frosted glass doors and stepped out into the pristine white marble corridor. The cluster of junior partners and paralegals who had gathered to watch the arrests immediately scattered, averting their eyes and rushing back to their cubicles. They parted for us like the Red Sea, recognizing the lethal, uncompromising authority radiating from our every step. We walked side by side down the long hallway, leaving the shattered remains of my biological family behind us. We reached the polished chrome elevators at the end of the corridor. Jamal pressed the call button. The gentle chime sounded instantly, and the heavy metal doors slid open. We stepped inside the empty car. Jamal hit the button for the lobby. The doors closed completely, cutting off the 42nd floor, severing my ties to the Sterling and Vance law firm, and permanently locking my family out of my life. The elevator began its rapid, smooth descent. I watched the digital floor numbers tick downward on the display panel. 40, 35, 20. With every floor we passed, a profound physical lightness washed over me. The invisible chains that had choked me since childhood were snapping one by one. The crushing weight of 35 years of relentless scapegoating, the constant suffocating pressure to prove my worth to people who were determined to misunderstand me, finally lifted off my shoulders. It evaporated into the sterile air of the elevator car. I took a deep, expansive breath, filling my lungs completely. I felt taller. I felt entirely free. The digital display hit the ground floor. The elevator chimed and the doors glided open, revealing the massive, sunlit expanse of the financial district lobby. We walked across the polished granite floors, passing the imposing security desks, and pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors. The bright, warm sunlight of the city hit my face instantly. The morning air was crisp and alive, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and the hum of a world moving forward. It was a beautiful Friday morning. Jamal led the way to the subterranean parking garage exit where our vehicle was waiting. We walked out onto the bustling sidewalk. The unmarked dark utility van, belonging to the federal task force, was already gone, having safely transported its newly acquired felons to the downtown holding facility. I stopped on the edge of the curb. I reached into my bag and pulled out my dark sunglasses. I unfolded the frames, feeling the smooth acetate beneath my fingertips. My parents spent 3.5 decades trying to make me feel like dirt beneath their designer shoes. I said, my voice steady, confident, and entirely devoid of bitterness. I looked up at the towering glass skyscraper we had just exited, a monument to the hollow, fragile egos of people like Silas and Terrence. They thought burying me in the mud would silence me. They thought treating me like a peasant would break my spirit. I slid the sunglasses onto my face, blocking out the harsh glare of the glass high-rises. They forgot one fundamental rule about dirt. I continued, turning to look at my husband. When you water it, it grows. And when you try to burn it down, it just hardens into stone. Jamal smiled, a wide, brilliant expression of pure love and absolute respect. He reached out and opened the passenger side door of our heavy-duty work truck, a vehicle my father had mocked just hours earlier for being rusty and unrefined. "Let us get back to the ranch," Jamal said, his voice rich with anticipation. "We have a $5 million deposit to verify and a lot of horses to feed." I climbed into the cab of the truck, the worn leather seat feeling like a throne. Jamal rounded the hood, hopped into the driver's seat, and fired up the heavy diesel engine. It roared to life with a deep, powerful rumble that vibrated right through the floorboards. He threw the transmission into gear and pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the chaotic flow of the downtown traffic. I leaned my head back against the headrest and watched the towering financial district fade away in the side mirror. We were leaving the ashes of their fake, fraudulent empire behind us, buried in the dark underbelly of a corporate law firm. We were heading back to our $22 million piece of Earth. Back to the open sky, the clean morning air, and the solid, undeniable truth of the land that Grandpa Ezekiel had trusted me to protect. The fire had taken my barn, but it had entirely failed to take my livelihood. It had only cleared the ground, burning away the dead weight, leaving a perfect, unyielding foundation for everything we were about to build next. True wealth is never found in hollow prestige or manipulative power, but in resilience and unwavering self-respect. When toxic individuals try to bury you, they completely forget that strong roots only grow deeper in the dark. This journey proves that setting firm boundaries and reclaiming your absolute independence is the ultimate victory against those who seek to destroy you. You do not owe loyalty or endless forgiveness to those who only offer betrayal and cruelty. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relationships to protect your peace, hit the like button and share your story in the comments below.